Good morning. We'll wait a second or two until we let the participants filter in so that they don't miss anything of today's program. And I see them filtering in pretty quickly, so we'll get started in 1 second. Para los que quieren escuchar en español, pueden oprimir por favor el icono abajo, interpretación, y Gloria Mejía, la paisa, es la representativa de Antioquia en ese panel, va a interpretar lo que vamos a hablar o decir en inglés. Bueno. Okay, let's get started. Colombia finds itself in a very difficult situation, which everybody knows about, and don't want to spend a lot of time talking about background. We're going to let the panelists talk about that. I just want to talk about a few housekeeping matters at the beginning, as I said in Spanish, but for those who can understand in English and want to listen in Spanish, there will be interpretation simultaneously, provided our wonderful interpreter Gloria Mejia from Medellin. So just please click on the interpretation button at the bottom and you'll be able to hear it in flawless Paisa Spanish. We will be taking written questions today. We will not be taking a verbal questions. So if you have them, as I'm sure everybody knows, please just enter them in the Q&A button below. Those are the first two things I need to say. And in terms of what else is upcoming, just so everybody knows, we have already posted on our website at ccacanada.com the video of our annual gala that we held last week, and a very fascinating conversation on converging on sustainability between Dr. Wade Davis, world-renowned ethnobotanist, anthropologist, with Mr. Sachin Shah, who's the Chief Investment Officer of Brookfield Asset Management. Brookfield Asset Management is the largest investor in renewables in the world. Fascinating conversation. The commentary coming back on that was stellar. And we also had the participation, among others, of former Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos. We will have an event on May 19th, a webinar, an analysis of the Chilean Constitutional Assembly vote. We will have an event on June 7th, the day after, on our Day After series on the Peruvian elections. We are still scheduling an event about Brazil. And last but not least, and this is near and dear to Sandra's heart, we will continue our ongoing series on looking for the center in Colombia, Buscando el Centro, a series of webinars that Sandra co-hosts with us, or co-moderates, maybe is a better word. And so far with important actors in Colombia right now, when those are looking to find some sort of a consensus in the center with view of the upcoming elections next year. So far, we've done 4, one with Humberto de la Calle, one with Juanita Gobertos, one with Fernando Cristo, another one with Juan Manuel Galan. We're scheduling several others. We just haven't announced them yet. They're all available, our past ones, again on our website at ccacanada.com. Okay, with those out of the way, let me quickly introduce. We have Ricardo Ávila, senior analyst at El Tiempo, longtime editor-in-chief of Portafolio. Sandra Borda, professor at Los Andes of political science, a columnist at El Tiempo, and the author of the widely read and respected book on the student movement and protest in 2019, Parar, avanzar. For those who haven't read it, highly recommend it. It's a good primer for what's going on right now. Sergio Guzmán, who is the director and co-founder of Colombia Risk Analysis, one of the top risk analysis companies in Colombia, widely published and commenting for an increasing amount of media, not just written, but also TV throughout the world. And Elizabeth Dickinson, who's the senior analyst at International Crisis Group for Colombia, and also, as the others, widely respected and widely read. So with those quick introductions, thank you all for being here on a very short notice. When we got to you, I think it was on Monday morning, you immediately said, yes, I want to do this event. So thank you to all of you for arranging your agenda to do this. Sergio, I thought, without me giving any introduction, let's just jump into it. I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about what this strike was all about. What was the immediate cause of it? Who's been involved in putting it together? And we'll take off from there.
Absolutely, Ken. And I first just wanna say what an honor it is to be invited here and to be here with Ricardo, with Sandra, with Elizabeth, and yourself to talk about this. The past week has been difficult one in Colombia, of course, and this may be a common theme here, but obviously tax reform was a trigger, but it wasn't the underlying condition that made the protests what they eventually became. Two things determine a protest's longevity in Colombia. The first is the diversity of its participants, and the second is the response by the government authorities. And in the first point, I just want to say there's a very wide array of participants, all of whom came to the fray with different motives. There's, of course, the student movement who has had pent up anger, and Sandra will address this much more eloquently than I could, since 2019. There's the people who have been uh, participating in the taxi cab protests, who joined the protest, and they're key because they know each city's key choke points. Nobody better than taxi drivers knows that. And they are protesting partly because Uber and online platforms are going to be regulated by the Colombian Congress. There's truck drivers unions who, again, better than nobody else, knows the country's transportation choke points and are key for that issue. They're protesting about increase in toll roads, increase in prices of gasoline, and government regulation over the price of transportation from different places in the country. In addition to that, there's growing frustration with the government after 1 year of COVID lockdowns, a significant increase in monetary poverty, the perceptions of inequality, and adding insult to injury in a way. Now there was the perception that the government was going to increase taxation, fueled, of course, by the government's poor communication strategy on the tax reform and a couple of events that showed really a disconnect between the government's impression of the prices of goods and what people were going through. And a key moment in all of that was when Finance Minister Alberto Carrasquilla was interviewed live on W Radio, and they asked him how much does a dozen of eggs cost, and he said the price was 1,800 pesos, when in reality it's about 10 times that. I buy 30 eggs for 12,000 pesos on the corner market in my house, but Carrasquilla was widely downplaying this. And so that's the first thing, right? The second thing, the diversity of protests. The second thing is the government's response to protests, which was short of being empathetic. It was short of being understanding of the legitimate concerns that protesters had. And it was not necessarily appealing directly to the causes. To give you an idea, I've been in Cali for since the 24th of April, and President Duque has been in Bogota since the 24th of April. And the crisis started and erupted here in Cali, and President Duque has remained in Bogota. The only high level government official to visit Cali is the Minister of Defense, who's also the head of the police. And so the response that the government has had to the crisis is a security response, not a political response, until very, very recently. And I know we're going to get into that at later points, but when the police responded forcefully to the protesters, that also sparked another trigger, another pent up anger that came from the 2019 protests, but also came in the 2020 Javier Ordóñez protests about police brutality. So it basically added another cause, another motif to the people and the parties protesting, which the government has wanted to discredit by calling out vandalism, which has occurred, but by saying that this vandalism has been instigated by illegal armed groups, this vandalism has been instigated by narco trafficking and even terrorist organizations. And I just want to clarify, I think these groups may be participating and may be taking advantage of the chaos created by the unrest. But that is by no means a suggestion that they're leading, that they're determining the direction of the protests or their scope and size. So the response has seemed to many tone deaf. And instead of any sort of acknowledgement of police wrongdoing, the government then has been turning it on the protests. But that's just a general overview, 10,000 feet. But I really look forward to hearing what others have to say today.
Thank you, Sergio. We're obviously going to come back to those observations and move on from that platform that you just set for us. Thank you. But before we do that, I want to call on Ricardo to talk a little bit about, although as Sergio said, the protests and the violence are a lot more now than they originally were theoretically about the tax reform. But that being the case, or be that as it may, Ricardo, can you talk a little bit about what some of the issues were in the tax reform that provoked the outrage amongst some or amongst many?
Well, first, Ken, thank you for the invitation. Greetings to all the panelists. Allow me to say at the beginning that yes, what is happening now, I believe, is a continuation of the movements we saw starting in November of 2019. And we had a parenthesis because of the pandemic, but the underlying currents were still there, and now they have resurfaced. And in that sense, the tax reform was the motive for people to protest what they saw as something unfair, which basically didn't necessarily correspond with what the proposal was. The proposal basically looked for large amounts of money, equivalent to almost 3% of GDP, but almost half of these funds were going to support social programs and particularly money transfers. So all the numbers that were presented show that, for example, the 10% of the 10% of the poorest Colombians would see an increase of 68% in their disposable income, and for a family that is living below the poverty line, that would have represented a huge change. Also, the numbers show that inequality will go down, and we have to remember is that Colombia is the second most unequal society in Latin America and the seventh most unequal society in the world. So in that sense, it was a shock treatment, if we can use the expression, in order to address the problems of poverty and inequality. But of course, as it happens, very few people read the tax reform. It was a very complex proposal. It had 110 pages, and it dealt with many things. But of course, it was clear at the same time that it had an effect on the middle class. And the middle class lives in the cities. So in that sense, sort of the fact that a large part of the urban population was going to be affected by this created a complication. And of course, we have to add to this the mistakes, huge mistakes made by the government in terms of communicating what this was. The Minister of Finance, the former Minister of Finance, Alberto Carrasquilla, was known as someone who rarely spoke. So in that sense, it was a major mistake. And of course, from the political point of view, when even the president's own party distanced itself from the tax reform, of course, the whole proposal was doomed. And instead of withdrawing the proposal in a quick decision, President Duque decided to hold on and on and on, and of course the whole problem began to increase in size. And now we have this situation in which basically the tax reform is behind us, but now we have a whole set of proposals. I mean, one of the demands, for example, of the demands from the organizers of this movement is that kids shouldn't be allowed to return to school even on a partial basis, and I mean this goes well beyond the original intent of the protest.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Sandra, I don't think any of the panelists are surprised about what's going on, maybe to the degree and perhaps the response from the government to a degree, but least of all surprised amongst all of us is you. And we talked about this in previous webinars with you, and you are the expert about what happened in 2019. Do you want to talk a little bit about why this is not just an isolated incident and the role of students and the student movement in all of this, which is something that is near and dear to your heart?
Yeah, hi, Ken. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm very glad to be here with Sergio, Ricardo, and Elizabeth, because I think that all of them have a pretty accurate and interesting assessing of this situation right now. And I absolutely share, you know, the contributions that Sergio and Ricardo have made so far. I would just add that even though we can think about the 2019 demonstration as the you know, very beginning of this social mobilization that we're observing right now, I think that it's also important to establish important differences in terms of what's happening right now and what happened back then, especially because I have the feeling, and this is all intuition, right? Because we haven't been able to study things as rigorous and as carefully as we would want, because everything is happening so fast that, you know, it's very hard. But my feeling is that back in 2019, the sort of social mobilization that we observed, first it was mediated by the role of a lot of social organizations, right? I mean, you had back then feminist organizations, environmental organizations, the students, the labor unions, and it seems like back then mobilization was a lot more organized that you can see right now. And even though the sort of you know, demands that they had were more, you know, messy, and it was difficult to know what they wanted. The students wanted one thing, the, you know, environmental organizations another thing, the labor unions another thing. So it was way more difficult to assess, you know, the sort of demands that they wanted the government to process. The students back then had an agenda that they still, you know, try to work with the government, because they haven't had any concise answers, you know, for these sort of reivindications. They had, you know, the demand they wanted, you know, accessible education, you know, in public universities. They want public universities to have more resources and more space for students. And they also, you know, demanded, you know, sort of policy about tuition rates and about loans for private universities, because that has become an increasingly, you know, difficult problem for them to the extent that they cannot go to public universities because public universities are not big enough and they don't have enough space for them. They don't have enough resources. Then they have to go to public universities, and since they are way more expensive than the public universities, they have to get these loans that are increasingly difficult to pay. So, you know, it was a very precise agenda, I would say. The sort of, I would call this time this a youth movement, not necessarily a student movement, because what you're seeing in the streets right now is not necessarily only college students. What you have right now has a lot of components of what we saw during September last year in the demonstrations, particularly in Bogota and other big cities, which is a kind of different segment of the population here. We're talking about effectively, we're talking about young people, but this is young people that are even in a more difficult situation than the students were in 2019, because these are people that have no access to education, they have no access to the workforce, and due to the pandemic and the confinement policies, now their own families are in a very difficult situation because their parents lost their jobs, they don't have a very clear support of social and economic support by the government at this point, even though the social policies have been in place, but they haven't been enough for the amount of people that are left outside of the job market and outside of the productive force in this country. So this is a little bit more of the same, but way more difficult and way more complex than it was in 2019 due to the confinement and the pandemic. So this is a mobilization that it's not so easily organized and controlled by social organizations, right? And this is a problem that we're dealing now, because when mobilization is not organized and is not guided, conducted by social organizations, then the probability of violence and the probability of public disorders due to the demonstrations is way higher. The scene was pretty well described by Sergio. What you have right now is people on the streets basically asking for, the design and implementations of clear social policies to deal with their situation. And the answer, you have basically a militaristic security answer. For the government, this is a public disorder issue. This is not a social issue, right? And then the issue that we need to talk about, which I think is the most important one, is basically that the response by the government is very problematic, to the extent that they are basically ignoring every single commitment that we have with human rights norms and agreements at this point. I mean, you have no certainty about the numbers right now, but we're talking about, between 27 and 30 something young people killed in the streets due to these demonstrations. So, and in this scenario, you don't have the government calling the attention of public of the force, the police and the army. You don't have them telling them that they have to stop, that they have to obey to the norms and the protocols. You basically have them encouraging them, and they are basically telling them, we have to control this disorder. We have to put security in place. We have to respect people and the right to work and the right to produce. And you have to do whatever you need in order to achieve that purpose. And I think that that's a very, very difficult and very dangerous sort of approach to this situation. And the result is right now, among other things, that we have the whole international community basically wondering about what's going on in Colombia. After a peace process, they had the hope that we were, in the path to complying with human rights norms. And at this point, we're sounding more and more like the type of country that we have, that we had in the 80s and at the beginning of the 90s. So this is an increasingly volatile situation to the extent that the government keeps violating human rights and the public force keep violating human rights in the streets. Then it's going to be more difficult for people to sit down and talk to them. Because it's very hard, I've said it many times, it's very hard to talk to a government that at night kills people in the streets and then during the day extends a hand to negotiate. This is very hard. I think that we can talk about this later, what the Coalición for the Esperanza is doing right now. It's a very brave move because they know that politically it's very risky to go now to the Palacio de Nariño and talk to the government. They are in a very bad position right now. But I think that dialogue and conversation is the only way forward here. So they are going to pay a high price. Every single person that goes to the Palacio de Nariño from now on is going to pay a very high political price for what they are doing. But this is something that we need to do. Otherwise, I don't see a way out of this crisis.
Thank you, Sandra. We are going to go back to that as what the way forward could be, or possible ways forward. Thank you. I was going to call on Elizabeth to talk about the security thing, but if Elizabeth, you can have patience for 2 more minutes. We have Paul Angelo who's listening. Paul Angelo from the Council of Foreign Relations, New York, an expert on reform of the Colombian military, who penned a widely read op-ed piece in the Washington Post earlier this week. If Paul, if you're on the line, do you want to talk a little bit about this problem or chronic problem with the overreaction, or like some would classify, or many might classify, I think many have classified as overreaction of the military and the police, and what are some of the underlining issues here?
Yeah, thanks, Ken, for the opportunity, and thanks to all the panelists who are here today for continuing to inform the international community about what's happening on the ground in Colombia. I very much admire the work that you've been doing. And just briefly, I just offer that, and second, echo what Sandra had said about sort of the response of the government being tone deaf. Sort of instead of lowering the temperature of public rhetoric surrounding the issues of excessive use of force and police brutality, the government, with the Minister of Defense and the Comandante de las Fuerzas Militares leading the charge, have come out in defense of the conduct of the police. And so what I think this really points to is a need to accept that the police in Colombia have committed abuses or have exceeded the acceptable use of force, which is something that isn't unique to these protests. It's something that actually sparked a wave of protest even last year, and accept that this is a systemic problem within the police as an institution. I would just say, in terms of the historic arc of police reform in Colombia in the 1990s, sort of building on the spirit of the Constituent Assembly, which oversaw the reform of the Constitution, President Cesar Gaviria also sought to civilianize the police force, gave it a civilian director. There was the first time that the Colombia had a civilian minister of defense. Also started preparing the police to engage in more community-minded policing. That was a process that was continued or facilitated during the years of Plan Colombia, where the police became part of the Uribe administration's national consolidation plan. And we got to a point in 2010 where the Colombian police director, Oscar Naranjo, was declared or selected as the world's best policeman, given the great credibility that the Colombian police had for their professionalism internationally, but also the popular support and approval that they had enjoyed for much of the early 2000s, where we saw police approval in the country upwards of 60, 70, and sometimes even 80% during the first decade of the century. The past decade, though, we've seen a number of abuses of authority, major corruption scandals, not the least of which was the Comunidad del Anillo in 2016, which saw the police director step down and more than 1,400 individuals within the force purged in the following year. And there was this instinct as well that finally the police would move to a period of reform, not focused on internal armed conflict, but rather on citizen coexistence, crime and violence prevention. And there was an impulse within the Santos administration to, at some point, relocate the police under a separate Ministry of Citizen Security, or perhaps even under the Ministry of the Interior. And in the wake of the scandals of 2016, the Santos administration convened a committee to provide recommendations for reform of the police, but with the change in government in 2018, that was sort of left on the table. And now what we've seen since the beginning of the Duque administration is a reluctance to implement all the terms of the peace accord as negotiated in Havana, a promotion of any number of individuals within the security sector tied to previous human rights abuses, to include falsos positivos, and sort of an overall return to violence in the countryside that has put the Colombian security sector, to include its police, back on a war footing. And that has been a failure in security policy at the political level, but it also represents an unfulfilled promise to once and for all civilianize the police force in Colombia, to be able to attend to the needs of an urban population. Colombia is a country in which 80% of the population lives in cities. And the Colombian people need a police force that knows how to deal with the exigencies and needs of the urban population.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thanks for joining us on short notice. Elizabeth, I see that you've been shaking your head up and down a lot and agreeing with a lot. And thank you again for being patient. There's a smorgasbord of issues here, and I see you taking notes all the way. I'm inclined to say, please feel free to comment on any of it that you've heard. You've written extensively on all of it. You've certainly done a lot on the security issues. Would you like to jump in first on the security aspects and anything else that you want? Take it from there, please.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ken, and thanks for the opportunity to be with all of you today. It's really an honor to share this space with so many experts. So I want to pick up on some of the points that Paul made, and then add a little bit more as well of a perspective from Colombia's regions. We've been traveling a lot recently throughout Colombia, and I think something that really differentiates what's happening now from past protests, but also from specifically 2019, is really the geographic spread and depth of this protest. We've seen protests in 27 of Colombia's 32 departments, almost 500 municipalities. That's almost half of municipalities, which is very significant when you think about the number of those municipalities that are largely rural. So this is a movement that is no longer just urban, but I think it's transcended that and has really become something that has absorbed grievances from throughout Colombia. So starting though, I think with this security issue, which I think is in many ways at the core of where we are today. Since the 2016 peace agreement, there hasn't been this moment of reckoning, this sort of shift in mentality and approach from the security forces that I think is being called for, being longed for in many parts of Colombia, certainly in the urban context, a shift in mentality and the way that policing is conducted, but also very much in urban areas. And I think what we've seen in the years since the peace agreement, and particularly since rural insecurity has reemerged as a significant problem in parts of the country, has been, in place of taking the opportunity to have that examination, what does the police force, what does the security force look like in peace? I think there's been, in fact, a shift backwards in mentality to sort of an old style approach to policing and security enforcement, particularly in the countryside, where you've seen the focus return to sort of killing, capture leaders of armed groups, the return to forced eradication of coca, the return to sort of a very heavy-handed approach towards operation, rather than thinking about communities and how to protect them more integrally, right? So in the context of sort of how these protests emerged, I think once you saw the sort of initial spark take place, you have, the economic grievances, then you stack on top of those the social grievances, then you stack on top of those the response and the way that the police have handled the situation, and it starts to escalate, right? I think where we are today is really the situation is a cry for help of a desperate social crisis. This is a very, very deep crisis. And I really want to be very blunt here. This is a deep social crisis. And I think what we haven't seen from the government is a sense of urgency about the gravity of the situation. It's almost as if they're sort of still bumbling around in their comfort zone with the people that they've discussed with the sort of things they've put on the table. I think there isn't the sort of gesture that I think we could see de-escalating the situation would be a grand gesture, some sort of acknowledgement that this is a moment that's been building for quite some time and requires a really comprehensive response. Instead, as my colleague panelists have mentioned, there has been this default slipping back into the security response. A great example of this is how to deal with the blockades across the highways and in and out of cities in Colombia. This is really alarming and serious situation because you have large parts of the country, the entire South mostly, that is now seeing shortages of gasoline, cooking gas. I was talking to friends this morning in Putumayo, they're cooking with wood because they have no cooking gas. In parts of Cauca, there are people who cannot mobilize, they cannot move out of their towns because there's no gasoline. So this is a very serious situation. It's a political situation. And it's a political situation that needs to be negotiated and dealt with in a political manner. Instead, the response from the Attorney General's office last night was to say, well, we'll just expropriate all of the cars that are blocking the roads. So not only is this completely logistically impossible, there are not even enough fiscales to prosecutors to undertake the cases that are already in the courts, let alone to go truck by truck, taking the ownership to free the highways. So completely logistically impossible, actually slightly crazy. But it's also just, it reveals the mentality that this is not a political problem, that this is just a situation of public order. So let me just stop with one final comment that I think maybe can help contextualize, particularly for a sort of international audience. Again, in the last few months, I've been in Putumayo, I've been in Norte Santander, I've been in Norte de Cauca, difficult regions of Colombia. This sense of desperation and frustration with this government is acute. The level of expectation after the peace accord, of course, was too high. After any peace agreement, this is natural, that there's always some sort of calm down effect. However, I think what has been lacking is these shows of sort of common touch, of really a political commitment to bringing not the specific parts of, X, Y, Z. It's not that they want to read the text and implement every line by line. It's they want the peace dividend. They want their lives to improve. And instead of that happening, life in many parts of the country has gotten worse. Of course, the pandemic has not helped this. It's made all of these wounds very raw, and that's an external circumstance. But I think we have to understand that this is a very deep social crisis that has roots across Colombian society. This is not one sector. This is a broad sort of cry from across the breadth and geography of this country.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I suppose one of the ironies as well that people find unfortunate was the appearance yesterday of the president of the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, standing beside the president and his cabinet, essentially in one of his points, endorsing what the government was doing on some of these matters, which, and they quote institutionality, which is it's a word that you hear a lot, making sure institutionality holds, where a number of people would have thought, including two dissenting judges, would have indicated that in fact that you have that the president of the Supreme Court doing something like that is actually shows the breakdown of separation powers and the breakdown of institutionality. But we'll leave that to the side for the second, because I wanted to call on Ricardo. Ricardo, obviously this is a government that listens to the business sector, as it should, as every government should, but particularly so with this government. What are they thinking right now? They can't be terribly pleased with where they see the government headed, or maybe they haven't been pleased for a while. You want to talk a little bit about what you're hearing from the CEO class and the altos empresarios?
Well, what I'm listening to is a huge concern and, of course, uncertainty about where the country is headed. There was, of course, some discomfort with the government previously because it is clear that this is not only an unpopular administration, but also very ineffective, makes lots of mistakes. But with elections coming during the first half of 2022, the original expectation a few weeks ago was that we would enter into a lame duck period in which basically the main responsibility from part of the government would be to oversee that the electoral process was going to be peaceful. But truly, the situation has changed, and the representatives from the private sector basically don't see the light at the end of the tunnel. And the main concern is that there are several scenarios, of course. One scenario is that we'll follow the path that Chile followed during the protests that began in October 19. Let's remember that the turmoil lasted 5 months. We could say that actually it has lasted much more because some of the problems haven't been solved, despite the fact that they are going to elect a constitutional assembly in a few days. But that's a huge concern, that basically this situation of having a country in which it is extremely difficult to to work and carry daily activities is going to be the foreseeable future. The other alternative, what people from the private sector expect, is that the government would engage in a series of conversations, beginning with the opposition, beginning of the leaders of the strike, and that they would make the effort to understand what these young people in so many municipalities are looking for. And I have heard from the heads of different enterprises of the willingness to do a little bit more, to take a larger burden, for example, in terms of taxes. But again, they don't see a clear signal from the government. All what they see is confusion. There's also a small criticism in which basically the people who are talking to a government representing the private sector are the heads of the trade unions. And the problem is that when they have these talks, basically the trade union A brings to the president, to the minister, its individual demands, and the trade union B does the same. And so there's not an overall vision. And some people in the either the banking sector, the financial sector, or industry are saying probably we'll have to step up to the plate. But again, we need a signal from the government, and they haven't seen that yet.
Thank you, Ricardo. Sandra, I think you wanted to jump in now.
Yeah, I think that one of the interesting things that we're in front of right now, and this is something that I find very similar to what happened in the States, is basically that the insatisfaction of people on the street has to do, of course, with the government and all the things that we've been discussing so far. But there are two additional actors that I think are also part of the, you know, this sort of triad, or this sort of triangle in which people find, people on the street, they say, find a lot of problems in this country. And I think that we're talking about the government, we're talking about the private sector, and we're talking about the traditional media. And you find people on the streets, and this network RCN, which is a very governmental and almost an official network, has been subject of attacks by the people who are protesting, and they are also complaining a lot about the fact that they seem to see the private sector to a very important extent that's disconnected from what's going on as the government itself. So you have sort of signals and things that happen that tend to corroborate that perception from people. So for instance, when the government announces that they're going to start conversations with many different sectors in the country, the first sector that goes to this conversation without demanding any sort of change of behavior by the government is the private sector, the gremios, right? That was the first meeting. It was gremios. It was, regional leaders and gobernadores, mayors, and the government. So what part of the problem here is that people, the sort of perception that people had about the tax reform, which I'm not an economist. I didn't read that thing. It was, as Ricardo said, it was too long. I don't have a position about that because I tend not to talk about things that I don't know of. But the perception that people had on the street was basically that it was a tax reform that was there to benefit, again, the same people, the private sector, the big corporations, et cetera, et cetera. So they tend to perceive that the government is very aligned, or the private sector is very aligned with the government, however you want to put it. So I think that that's going to be a problem for the private sector if they want to play a role in which they help to get us out of this trouble, because they don't have credibility and they don't have the amount of public support that you would have them to have in order to be part of that conversation. And same thing happened with the traditional media, right? At the very beginning of these demonstrations, traditional media reject the possibility of being the ones talking about what was going on the streets. They didn't want to talk about people who were being killed. They didn't want to talk about the human cost of what was going on. They instead choose to talk about the economic problem, the problem with production, the blockades, which is important, of course, because people live from food, so the fact that they are not receiving food is a problem, but they didn't seem to have enough sensibility to what was going on. So they choose to talk about the material damage of the demonstration instead of talking about the human cost of what was going on. So that's a problem. I don't think that that's something that we should be happy about, because I think that those are actors that are crucial in order to achieve a sort of solution to what's going on. To the extent that we have more and more actors, social and political actors, being associated with the lack of legitimacy by the government, we're deeper in trouble, right? We need people, we need political and economic leaders that people feel connected to, because otherwise the government is not going to be able to have a conversation, because it's not easy to tell right now who represents people on the streets. I mean, there's this strike committee, or the Comité de Paro, but people on the streets also say that the Comité de Paro do not represent them. So if it's not them, who represent people on the street? And that's a problem, because if you don't have a very clear representation, a very clear leadership here, it's going to be impossible to talk. It's going to be impossible to establish a sort of dialogue in order to construct solutions and just pass the page. So this is something that we really need to think about, because we've been seeing in surveys from a long time ago the same trend. People do not trust institutions. People do not trust political parties. Do not trust political leadership. So if those institutions and political leadership and parties are not going to be able to serve as a conduct, for the civil society to communicate with the government and to establish a conversation, then we have no exit. And that's something that concerns me a lot.
Thanks, Sandra. Well, we're going to spend a few minutes seeing if there is a bit of an exit, or at least a way forward. Before we do that, I think Sergio wanted to say something more about private sector.
Yeah, and just to mention something, I think the first reaction from the government when a crisis hits is to tell its main stakeholders, hey, you have to surround institutions, you have to surround the government. And the private sector has been very keen on closing ranks with the government. But I want to mention that that is carrying now a high political cost, because many private sector institutions are issuing press releases surrounding institutions, but not condemning unequivocally police violence or trying to diminish how serious it has been. And that carries a huge reputational risk going forward, because that may suggest that they're taking sides. And of course, the private sector has long been an advocate of free markets, an advocate of property rights, an advocate of this government's policies on trade and finance. But that should not put a wedge between them and their consumers, their workers, and the people who are inhabiting the same territory as they are. So I think it's very concerning, because many members of the private sector that I speak to have been said, well, we just want to prevent becoming the next Venezuela, and we want to prevent an outcome in the next electoral cycle that goes against our interests. I would say the majority of Colombians are on that same boat. They don't want an electoral outcome that goes against the country's interests. They don't want an electoral outcome that makes the country less prosperous. They don't want an electoral outcome that crumbles our factors and our means of production. But by not empathizing with the deep social crisis and the situation that we find ourselves in, is going to be very difficult for the private sector. And going forward, I think a key moment where we can tell whether or not the private sector is expressing that empathy is come December, when we have to negotiate the minimum wage. Because the minimum wage increase is problematic for Colombia, because so many items are pegged to the minimum wage price or to the minimum wage established by the government. So that obviously is going to have externalities for the private sector throughout its cost structure, throughout its value chain. That's why the private sector is so adamant on that price not increasing significantly, whereas the unions and the workers always say, look, with devaluation, with the cost of goods, with inflation pressures, the purchasing power of our wage is diminishing year on year. And the business sector is asking us to produce more. And in absolute dollar terms, you're arguing maybe $7 or $8 worth for a percentage point. The last agreement negotiation, and Ricardo can please correct me if I'm wrong, the private sector wanted a 4% increase. The workers' unions wanted an 8% increase, and we got a 5% increase. But that 5% roughly is a $10 or $15 per month increment, depending on the exchange. So the private sector can't, put a wedge between them and this very large constituency over $15 a month. Doing so is I think politically foolish and puts them at a reputational hazard going forward.
Thank you very much, Sergio. Just before I turn to Elizabeth now to talk a little bit about possible ways forward, I want to say we know that there's been well over 20 questions waiting. We tried to weave some of them in, and I think some of the panelists' comments have addressed some of the questions. We'll try and get in a little bit more before we close the panel, but thank you for them, and they are being read, and we'll try to try and do the best we can with them. Elizabeth, the way forward, or any other comments you may have about the private sector or the allegations of the government about outside actors who are the instigators of these protests. Maybe let's start with that a little bit, because that's sort of the leitmotif that the government has in explaining why things are the way they are.
Sure. So I'm glad we get a chance to address this, because I think it's a very important issue to tackle head on. So again, as you mentioned, I think one of the main justifications that the government has used for their security response is this argument that it is FARC dissidents, or it is ELN, or it is some other criminal organization that's really, organizing this violence and these protests. I want to say, first of all, that we have no evidence that that's the case. They have not presented any evidence that that is the case. And we haven't seen any from our field research, from our conversations. I can't tell you today that I have seen anything that would make me believe that that is the driving force between these protests. It's not. However, of course, this is a chaotic situation, and this is Colombia. And so, of course, are bad actors, so to speak, going to take advantage of the situation? Absolutely. And for sure, that happened in 2019. Looking retrospectively at the past, we do have evidence that it did take place in a very limited manner in that time. For example, there was evidence after the 2019 protest that there was a payment made by potentially a FARC dissident front, potentially from another criminal organization, to poor migrant workers in the suburbs of Bogota to burn buses. Okay. So this was not an armed group carrying out a protest or an activity. It was an armed group paying opportunistically to take advantage of a situation to cause chaos. Certainly this situation, who does it favor? I mean, it favors the consolidation of control of illicit interests, not just in the cities, but in the countryside. When there is any sort of moment of social upheaval, it's an opportunity for these groups to install stronger social control. And this is dangerous, and it should be worrying to the government. Not an excuse to crack down, but in fact, a reason to find a political exit to this situation as soon as possible. But again, let's be clear, it's very different to say that armed groups might benefit from this situation than to say that they are the cause of the situation, which is very much not the case. The reason people are on the street is not because of armed groups are pushing them to do so. This is not the majority of any of the vandalism or violence that we've taken place. And if the government has evidence to the contrary, they should absolutely present it. But I have not seen any. I think that leads us, I think, a little bit into where we could start to shift the mentality towards the approach to the problem. Sandra spoke very eloquently about this challenge that we have, that there isn't a clear leadership in the protests. I would argue that there's also a leadership problem from the government. This is a government that's weak, very weak. They have no coalition in Congress. And in fact, Duque is facing an internal challenge within his party. And I think this has kept him preoccupied and in many ways explains the inability to reckon with the gravity of the situation, because the presidency is preoccupied with an internal political challenge without realizing that the external political dynamics are in fact even more alarming. So I think that is a first challenge that we have to deal with. Personally, I don't think there's a clear answer for it. I think there are some clear first steps that could get us on a better path. One of those, I think, would be to see a clear indication from this government and senior officials that civil institutions have the ability to hold the security forces accountable. We have not seen a high-level official condemn unequivocally police brutality. It has not happened. That is a clear first step, and it has to happen because it's an indication that, as the government argues, this is a country of institutions. If you want to make that clear, hold the security forces accountable, just as anyone should be held accountable for violence against police. It has to be a two-way street. Second, I would say that the government can make some very easy and clear changes in their behavior that would help change the perception that they're aloof and disconnected from reality. For example, senior officials, congressmen who are linked to the government party should not be going to the US to get vaccinated. While vaccines are trickling in 5,000, 10,000 at a time to Colombia during the worst pandemic crisis that we've faced so far. This is just an absurd disconnect between the everyday reality of Colombians standing in line to get basic medical care and senior officials who fly to Miami on vacations to get vaccinated. I think a third point would be that, and this will be a challenge going forward, is as we've discussed, because the demands are so diverse, any sort of negotiation, I think, is going to have to happen at lots of different levels. The national level, where there's obviously transcending issues, but also at a local level. You're going to have mayors, governors involved in dealing with the very specific micro level grievances of this transport union, of this, teacher syndicate, of this particular sector that's blocking this road. So it's going to have to be multi-layered. And I think those local authorities need the support to do that. I want to make one final point, which is that I think these accusations of infiltration, they have to be taken much more seriously in terms of, we really shouldn't be using this as a blanket excuse. Why? Because it has very, very dangerous consequences in terms of violent spillover. The history of Colombia is that accusations against broad sectors, for example, indigenous group or X group of people, they turn into violence. And this is a very dangerous situation. When you argue that the protesters are infiltrated by the FARC, this is an excuse for violence against them, not necessarily from the government, but from others who are in the environment, right? So we have to be very careful when we have these accusations floating around, because they are playing with fire in terms of the level of violence and conflictivity that this can generate in the short and medium and then longer terms. I'm sorry, I spoke too long, but stop there.
No, you didn't speak too long at all. Thank you. Ricardo, I want to go to you, and then I want to go to Sandra on the way forward. But Ricardo, should anybody have expectation that the government will change its fundamental course or view on this? Obviously, there was a change of finance minister to Jose Manuel Restrepo, who many thought was the best cabinet minister in the Duque government, and clearly has a different profile than his predecessor, maybe known for being more of a conciliator and a listener, maybe less ideological. But other than that, do you foresee any epiphany amongst those in the government? And I guess the question, and this goes to a question, several direct questions we had. that ties into your lame duck question is exactly who's running the government now, with the subtext being, is it actually the current president or is it a former president who's running the government? So there's a few questions for you, Ricardo.
Let me begin with the last question. It is not Uribe, okay? There is a vacuum in power, clearly, but the government theoretically is still headed by Duque, but the problem is that he basically is concentrated on this. So so other matters are in someone else's hand. I have very few expectations that this will be solved in the right way. I believe that what will happen is, as we have seen this morning, when parts of the opposition went to the presidential palace, is that some of the players, or most of the players here, realized that it is against their own interests in the future to have this situation deteriorate, in a sense that we follow from protests and lack of resources in some of the food and other resources in some of the cities, to a complete state of anarchy. So in that sense, they are going to throw, if we can use the expression, the government a lifeguard. And in that sense, I believe there is going to be some basic agreements, some reforms, nothing dramatic, some sort of commission to, for example, investigate police brutality, and probably to address the issue of reforming police. But I don't see Duque being different than what Duque is a person who is very slow to react. Not only when he has he is under real pressure, he finally moves, but he's very slow to respond. So in a sense, he will try to do things gradually, but again, in a few months, he will be sort of a minor figure, in the sense that he will be basically as a caretaker while the electoral process takes place. I don't see any sort of cabinet that represents all different forces and a new start for Colombia. I don't see that. Absolutely, yes, the Minister of Finance fell, but he was replaced by someone from Duque's cabinet, and that shows the way he thinks and the way he behaves. So sadly, even if people get tired of this situation and the level of the crisis diminishes, again, the major problems are not going to be solved this time. And I believe that's going to be a major sound of alarm for the next government, which will come into office with many issues still unsolved, and we have to deal with that, or with this.
Thank you, Ricardo. Sandra, that sort of leads us to, and there are a lot of questions about this, what are possible ways forward?
Oh, yeah, I tend to agree with Ricardo. I think that sadly, we're not going to see like a structural resolution to this situation right now. The problem is that we still have a year and a little bit more to go of this government, right? So if we tend to, get used to this situation, and we agree with the fact that we're going to live like this for a year and a half, I mean, there's not going to be any country left after this whole thing, right? So we need to solve this somehow. I think that we're going to be far from an optimal solution here, but we need to do something. I mean, the stasis is not the solution for this situation. So I would say, I think that there's another factor that plays into this, which is basically that there are a lot of political sectors and part of the opposition that can, win a little bit with this situation and with the social unrest, right? I mean, there's political benefit in not talking to the government, in not solving the situation and letting the government sink in, with the crisis with the rest of the country in order to construct a political platform as a salvation, right? So what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that there are political sectors outside of the government who are benefiting from the chaos and would like to maintain the chaos in order to construct a political platform, right? So we need to be careful with that because too many people interested in just keeping this, very bad situation in place are just bad news. So where do I find the sort of beginning of the solution for this whole thing? And this might be a professional bias, but I think that the international community has a very important role to play here, because the first and most important issue that we need to solve is the human rights situation and police abuse. And I think that the only actor that the government is going to listen to in this precise moment is the international community. And I guess that's euphemism for the US. Because I think that, we already know what happened with the United Nations. The United Nations, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, complained officially about the human rights situation, and the government answered saying, what the hell? We feel betrayed by the United Nations, right? Which is, they know that they don't lose anything confronting the US, the UN with this issue. But there's a whole different story with the US, because I think that they are very concerned about what's going to happen with the security cooperation system. They are concerned about resources. They know that the security situation in this country cannot be worse than this. And that they need the resources, the US resources, in order to try to maintain some order here. There's a very interesting story about this whole thing, which is basically that the Democratic Center, the Uribism, that sounds funny in English, el Uribismo, in this country had a very important credential, which was basically that they were tough on crime and they were tough on security. That was their strength, right? I mean, that's basically what they were supposed to do, and they were good at. Well, this government showed that they are not able to show that credential anymore, right? I mean, the results in terms of security and the security policy that they have implemented so far can be very easily described as a failure. So at this point of the story, this is the only thing they have in hand in order to overcome this crisis, and for that they need at least the resources, because they know they don't have the political support from the U.S. government. The role that they play during the presidential election in the U.S. left them basically in a very bad position with that government, and right now the only thing that they can hope is basically not to be cut off of those resources in the House of Representatives. And I know that you saw that a couple of tweets a couple of days ago from the House of Representatives saying, well, you better take care of the human rights situation in your country, because we have this amendment, this beautiful amendment that basically allow us to cut the flow of money if your forces keep committing human rights crimes. So I think that, at least in order to overcome a little bit the very bad human rights situation in this moment, the international community needs to be a little bit more forthcoming and louder, because they are the only ones who have the power to pressure the government right now in this direction.
Thank you, Sandra. I want to go to Sergio for a final comment, but I just want to follow up with you, Sandra. You mentioned the litany of issues by which the United States, in the executive branch and the legislative branch, was upset with Duque from the beginning, from the beginning of the Biden administration in the House, even before the intervention in the U.S. elections, various stances that have been made. Yet certainly it was a calculated risk to do it anyway. And there has not been a phone call so far between President Biden and President Duque, which is a glaring fact. And that it's still being handled the way it's handled. So my question for you is, does it matter? I mean, except the Colombian government is making the decisions it's making, it must know and calculate what their US reaction would be, that it would not be positive, and yet the government's doing it anyway. So I guess the question is are they really going to listen to what the U.S. government may want them to do, or to say, look, we're on our own and we're going to do it no matter what. We'll pay whatever price, and we dare the U.S. government to actually cut us off because they don't really want to do that.
And yet another instance of disconnection, right? I mean, the US government has been sending the message over and over and over again that they are concerned about the human rights situation and they are concerned about the implementation of the peace process, right? Since the very beginning of the Biden administration, they have been sending this message. And the government hasn't listened to this. I mean, they've been trying to do things here and there to get a little bit closer to the new administration in Washington, but they haven't been successful, I would say. To the extent that our relationship with the US is the most important relationship in terms of foreign policy, to the extent that, the big principle that guides our foreign policy for a century is our alignment with the US, and to the extent that the US is our main contributor in terms of economic assistance, social assistance, military assistance, and it's basically our ally in the context of this region that at times seems a little bit hostile to our government. I think that they cannot afford to not give a damn about that. I think that they need to be concerned. They need to approach. I think they've been trying to do things to approach the U.S. government, but I guess that this is not a country, and we have no history in the U.S. that leads us to think that we're going to be able to say, the hell with the U.S. We're going to go ahead with this thing. They cannot afford that, and don't just miss the fact that the Centro Democrático and the right in this country was supposed to be very close to the US, right? I mean, they were the big defenders and the big advocates of our alignment to the US. So if they don't have the US in the community, in the international community, then who do they have? And if they don't have anyone, are they willing to turn into a sort of new Syria? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I guess perhaps maybe there's also some banking on the fact that Castillo is doing so well in Peru. He may not win, but it sets up the same dynamic all over again, that the Castro Chavismo, and that in this case with Peru, that in fact, Colombia would be the meat in the sandwich between Venezuela and a quote communist Peru, right? And so that dynamic goes on and on and on. Sergio, you started us off, so I have the honor of giving you the final word. I know you like to talk about what political implications could be from all of this, and it's very, very speculative, and kinds of things that Sandra and I are exploring in our webinar on Looking for the Center, which will now refortify. But there have been some. What's that? What's that?
We still haven't found, but we keep looking for the center.
Well, hopefully it's not like looking for Godot. Sergio, I know you like to talk about what political implications could be. There have been a number of questions about this, very, very speculative, things change, et cetera, with all those qualifiers. Go ahead. I'll give you the last word. Take your shot at it.
Thanks, Ken. I just want to very quickly respond because I'm reading the room. Canada also has cards to play here. It's not like Colombia's only relationship with North America is with the United States, or with the Western world is with the United States and some European countries. Don't forget that in 2018, in March 2018, Colombia signed an addendum, a labor addendum to the free trade agreement with Canada, where ESMAD reform was a key issue. And the Colombian government had to present the Canadian government every January 30th or the next business day. I read the piece, a report on what it was doing to reform the ESMAD that had been widely criticized for abuses. And so I think Canada has an important card to play here, diplomatically and commercially, which will definitely help the Colombian government listen. And I'm not saying that they should exercise any options, but very similar to what Congressman Greg Meeks said, hey, there's the Leahy Act. I think it would be important for Canada to say, hey, there's a labor addendum to the free trade agreement. And that would, not doing anything, but saying that it exists should put the Colombian government on alert. But
well, let me just interrupt to say you just spoke directly to a number of people in the Canadian government who are listening at this moment. So
I'm
your
reading the
message has
room,
been
Ken.
delivered.
I'm
Okay.
reading the room. But look, obviously, what a lot of people in the business sector are speculating is, will this have implications for the 2022 elections? And what does this mean for Petro's potentially becoming Colombia's next president? And I don't want to speculate, and I don't want to say, hey, he's going to win, he's not going to win. But let's hypothetically think he wins, right? Let's imagine that scenario where Petro is president. Petro's probably not going to have a majority in Congress. So the majority in Congress is probably not going to pass a legislative package from Gustavo Petro in any way, shape, or form without significantly watering it down. Petro is not going to be able to appoint members of Colombia's central bank. Petro is not going to be able to pack the Colombian courts.
Sergio, let me just interrupt for just 1 second. But before we get to that, do you think that Petro is a natural beneficiary of what's going on right now, or do you think it's still very unclear?
It's very unclear because the situation hasn't petered out. And I see Ricardo and Sandra nodding their heads, and I agree with them. I think it's not immediate to say he's the direct benefactor of the current situation. What we can say is that this is in no ways beneficial for an incumbent. And so in that regard, anyone but an incumbent has an edge over the next elections. But what I want to do is I want to play out the scenario of what it would look like if Petro won. And if you would bear with me, I just have a couple of points because I already discussed Congress is going to be a non-starter. The only control organization that the president can directly nominate is the ombudsman, who is supposed to control the government itself, right? But the attorney general, the public prosecutor, the procurador, and the controller are going to be in their post for at least 2 years if that occurs, and they're going to be anything but compliant with the government. In addition, any attempt at a plebiscite has to pass both through Congress and through the Constitutional Court, which also is not going to be controlled by in that scenario. So what you're going to see is a very bitter Gustavo Petro, who although the executive has a significant power in Colombia, and that's also to blame of our constitutional architecture, which has suffered significant changes. He's not going to be able to do away with a lot of the systemic economic stabilizers that Colombia has, in particular things like the debt ceiling or the regla fiscal that limits the amount of borrowing Colombia can do. If you want to look for a very realistic, what would a Petro presidency look like, I would suggest you look at Mexico. And Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico has proven to be anything but democratic. He's been brazenly promoting from within the military, statizing some of the investment projects, eliminating some competition on tenders. But as far as I'm concerned, Mexico is still a capitalist country, still run by market rules. So sure, Mexico's democracy is taking a huge toll and taking a huge risk with Andrés Manuel López Obrador, but I would posit that it takes more than one man to burn this to the ground.
Thank you, Sergio. Okay, we're way over time, but I know we opened up a topic that everybody likes to speculate on. It's the national pastime in Colombia to speculate on political futures. So Ricardo or Sandra, Elizabeth, anybody, 30 seconds. Yeah, Sandra, I know. Okay, very, very briefly, what could be if you were, if you're in business and you're trying and game what might happen or understand what might happen till we get to August next year when a new president takes over, and what might happen in that election. What would you speculate right now?
It's not straightforward, and I think that we're facing two different scenarios, almost opposite scenarios, right? I mean, the social unrest might be a good opportunity for Petro to the extent that he has the most solid social, political discourse and platform right now. If you wanna hear social transformations in this country, a proposal about social transformations right now, he's probably the one who has the more credibility and the more to say about this. But if you have been buying the story about the Castro Chavismo being the most important threat in this country, then for you, this social unrest is the face of the risk you are facing if you take the left to power. So it depends on which story is going to sell better. But I think that this is subject of both interpretations. So I don't think that this is necessarily a win, a political win for the left and for Petro.
Thank you, Sandra. Ricardo, some may have thought, certainly in the past, that the CEO class, as it were, or the altos empresarios, may have been a pretty solid base of support for the Centro Democrático. Maybe that's a overgeneralization. Do you think that they would be willing to go down that road this time, or do you think there's a strong push within them that the need to find some centrist candidate who can win this election, and that's where they will put their support? Not, again, there are different stripes within that class, as it were, but in general, what's your thought about that?
My thought in general, not only regarding the business community, is that this process is actually hurting the extremes in Colombia. The extreme right, basically, or the people that were tied to Uribe have proven incapable of running the government in the right way. And on the other hand, people's fears are going to be exacerbated by this situation regarding Castro Chavismo. And actually, there's a declaration from Petro saying that the strike should end because Petro realizes that the pendulum is moving against him because he's going to be, in a sense, held accountable for what's happening. So my forecast and my theory is that actually any candidate with a possibility of winning the next presidential election will have to be from the center left or center right. What I have seen, for example, in the case of Oscar Iván Zuluaga, who I believe is going to be the candidate from the Centro Democrático, is that he's presenting himself as a moderate. And so in that sense, whoever wins the center is going to win the presidential election. Yes, we will have sort of some people from the extremes running for president, but I don't believe that will be the winning candidate in either nor the right nor the left. I believe the center. Of course, the big question is: are we going to find a leader who is able to convince public opinion to rally behind that person?
Yeah, and the critical issue of getting into the second round.
Absolutely, yes.
Which is arguably what prevented the center by a couple 100,000 votes last time from winning the election. I think there's an argument.
Absolutely, but the conditions are different this time.
Yeah. Elizabeth, I was going to give Sergio the final word, but I didn't. So I want to. The final one with you is how you spend maybe more time than any analyst in the campo, as you just mentioned, where you've been traveling to recently and where you've been. Do you have any sense of how this dynamic is playing out politically with visions for the election next year?
So I would say that more than sort of any specific candidate, I think what one of the things that more rural areas of the country are looking for is an indication that someone is willing to save the peace agreement. And I say save intentionally because I actually do think that we're on the brink of sort of losing the momentum of the ability to implement the peace accord in the way that it was intended, in a way that would consolidate peace in a medium and long term in the country. I think this is really a tipping point. and a failure to have sort of a failure to act in this moment, and I think really to show a decisive commitment going forward to some of the basic tenets of that accord, it could really fracture the already very minimal trust between communities in conflict areas and the government. You know, after 2016 agreement, there was almost this like honeymoon period for the Colombian state in the countryside, where they had this level of trust that they hadn't had in decades. You know, this idea that they could bring institutions and that they could finally establish this, you know, holy grail of state presence that we all love to talk about. And I really do actually think that that is slipping away very quickly. Much more quickly than we realize. And obviously none of these things are easy, but I would just say that, you know, from a sort of medium to long-term perspective, we can't lose sight of that goal, because that is sort of the long-term stability of Colombia, is not only sort of addressing these initial immediate term political challenges, but really trying to find a path forward.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. We've gone way over our time. Thank you for everybody, all the panelists for staying with us. We've maintained most of our audience through this. I'm sorry we didn't get to the questions. We're, you know, well over 40, but some of them we did. Just one question I will answer briefly. There was a question from one of the audience, Daniel Navarro, suggesting 3 people that Sandra and I should be interviewing for our Buscando el Centro. And let me just say to him that we're already in conversations with 2 out of the 3 of them, and believe that we will be able to announce that they will be appearing shortly, amongst many others. With that, thank you very much to the panelists. We hope that this was going to be a very stimulating conversation, which certainly is timely. We know that we had a large amount of viewers. This is an issue, as all of our listeners know, we follow closely. We will continue to do so. A video of this event will be available in English and Spanish by tomorrow, maybe tonight, on our website at ccacanada.com, as are the announcements of all future events and videos of all our past events. With that, I close the event. Thank you to Gloria Mejia for the interpretation. Thank you, as always, to Marta Blackwell, the Vice President of the Canadian Council for the Americas, for all her work in putting this together, and to our annual sponsors who actually give us the funding to make all of these webinars possible and bring them to everybody in a complimentary basis. With that, thank you very much, everybody. Have a good rest of your day.